Hey everyone, Eric Helms back from 3D Muscle Journey, and I'm here, thank you Omar for having me, to once again talk about learning the hows and whys of topics so that you can become a better student of the sport, practitioner, better reach your fitness goals, or a better trainer depending on what's relevant to you. Today we're going to be talking about a much loved topic among my bros and sisses, protein. So step one, let's make sure we get all on the same page. Macronutrients are where we derive our energy. Okay, calories come from macronutrients. There are carbohydrates, there are fats, and there are proteins. Proteins have 4 calories per gram, as well as carbohydrates, and fat has 9 calories per gram. So when you look on the back of your nutrition label and it shows how many grams of carbs, fat, and protein, if you multiply them by 4, 4, and 9, and then add them together, you'll see that's quite close to the total calorie content of the food. Any discrepancy is because of potentially the way your country counts fiber, the types of fiber in the food, and also rounding errors, and potentially just a mislabeling. Okay? So, protein's where we get energy. However, the energy we get from protein is not as easily converted into energy. So here's something to think about. Carbohydrates and fats are pretty much directly converted into their constituent substrates that we use for energy. However, protein is built of amino acids. Okay? Now, some amino acids can be directly metabolized, some directly metabolized in muscle. A group that you guys are probably familiar with or have heard before is the branched chain amino acids, but there are others. And the other amino acids have to be converted in the liver to other substrates. So essentially, it's an energy inefficient process of turning protein into energy. For the most part, we think of protein as a building block of our body, which is why us bros and sisters care about it so much. We lift weights to try to stress the muscle so that it grabs the proteins and builds a bigger muscle, more or less. Okay? So, this is another reason why it's not appropriate to set protein as a percentage of your calories, but rather in relation to your body weight. So people typically talk about protein in relation to body weight, such as grams per kilogram, grams per pound, or grams per pound of lean body mass, or grams per kilogram of lean body mass. And if I say grams per pound or grams per kg, I mean grams per pound or grams per kg of total body weight. And if I say lean body mass, I mean lean body mass. So no one asked me that. All right, getting back to it. Protein primarily used for build and repair. It can be used for energy, but it's an energy inefficient process. One way to measure this is what's called the thermic effect of food. So when you have a very protein-rich meal, mostly protein, roughly 30% of that is actually the energy it provides is burned off in the process of turning it into energy. Compared to fat, which is almost no energy. There's almost no thermic effect of food of a fat-based food. And carbohydrate is somewhere in between that negligible versus 30%. So protein is essentially the most energy inefficient macronutrient we can eat, okay? Which has some interesting implications that we'll get back to as we continue through this process. So now we know what protein does, why it should be related to body mass, that it provides energy. Okay, we want to be eating a lot of it, right? More protein we eat, more we have to build. Remember though, you can't just simply eat more and more and more and more protein and get bigger and bigger and bigger at a linear rate, because protein is not what causes muscle to adapt. Your training is what causes muscle to adapt, and then you use that protein. So of course there's a limit to how much benefit you can get from eating protein. Eating way too high of protein forces your carbohydrates or your fat low, right? To compensate for calories. But if you don't drop your carbohydrates and fat low and you just increase everything, then you just get sloppy. Or do you? We'll talk about that later. But how much should you take in? Well, if you talk to Captain Brocephus bench a lot, and your gym, the big jack dude who is the biggest guy and benches the most, he might tell you something really high, like 2 grams per pound. However, if you go then talk to a nutrition professor, they would tell you the RDA, or maybe if they're a sports nutrition specialist, somewhere around twice the RDA is kind of a cap. The RDA, or the recommended daily allowance, at least in the United States, is 0.8 grams per kg. So why is there such a huge discrepancy? Well, in essence, Captain Brocephus and your nutrition professor are answering 2 different questions. All right? The vast majority of nutrition research is out there for health, preventing malnutrition. So organizations like the World Health Organization might sponsor research on what's called nitrogen balance. Okay? So nitrogen is an element that is only found in protein. So we can measure whether or not we are losing body proteins or gaining body proteins or maintaining body proteins by measuring the nitrogen in our foods and the nitrogens we excrete. So the RDAs are the level at which you can maintain nitrogen. Essentially, these are a minimum protein intake for health. A very different answer to the question that you're asking than what Captain Brocephus would tell you. He's trying to tell you what he thinks is the most protein you should eat to get the maximum benefit from your training. Now, before we really dive into what's an appropriate intake, let's talk about safety. This is something people are often concerned about. So, first off, there's been suggested that metabolic health could be affected by protein, that you're overstressing maybe your kidneys, maybe your liver, and now we've got a fair bit of research on actually some pretty high protein intakes that would suggest that this is not the case. So here, as you can tell, what I'm putting up are multiple studies on intakes around 2 grams per pound, and the lowest one I'm showing here is around 1.5 grams per pound, and some right around 1 gram per pound, and all of them showing that the metabolic panels are right within normal ranges, okay? And research is still happening on this, and I believe Jose Antonio has said he's going to be publishing a study pretty soon on a year-long study, people taking in around 1.5 to 2 grams per pound of protein, and there are no issues, okay? And this is healthy people. Of course, if you have issues with renal function, if you only got one kidney, for example, it is not a good idea to eat a very high-protein diet. But if you are a healthy training adult, there is nothing to fear about a high-protein diet, okay? So with that myth gotten out of the way, let's move forward and talk about what is an appropriate intake. Well, we'll take the Wayback Machine to around 2012, 2013 when I was doing my second master's degree here in New Zealand, and I was studying protein intakes in dieting resistance-trained athletes who were getting leaner. Now, I proposed the hypothesis in a systematic review that got accepted in 2013 that it makes sense for lean dieting resistance-trained athletes like a bodybuilder who's dieting for a competition or a powerlifter cutting for a weight class to eat a higher protein intake. Reason being is that when we start dieting, protein breakdown goes up. This is because we have less total calories, so we have to get more energy from somewhere, okay? As you get leaner and as your body fat stores go down, your protein utilization as fuel, as energy, increases, as does when your glycogen levels go down or your stored carbohydrates. So as you decrease your body fat, as you decrease your energy stores, as intramuscular triglycerides, and as muscle glycogen levels drop, protein utilization goes up, okay? In addition, you're probably doing more activity. And the higher activity levels, the higher your protein requirements just to meet that nitrogen balance level. So if you're doing cardio, you're doing weight training, you're leaner, and you have lower levels of glycogen, all of those are going to increase protein breakdown. So my hypothesis was, hey, maybe we should increase protein to offset that. However, other interesting things happen when you diet. Your protein synthesis rate gets more efficient, so you get a better response per dose of protein. Now, why would that happen? Because you need more. Right? So the whole reason the body gets more efficient with something is because it needs more of it. Protein breakdown levels are going up. It's kind of a safeguard, right? So it's an indication of your body guarding against muscle mass loss. And typically this is a losing battle. When you look at dieting studies on athletes over long periods, especially when they're trying to go from lean to leaner or average to lean, more often than not, there is muscle mass losses. So of course we know that this increase in protein synthesis efficiency doesn't make up for that shortfall. Or people would just be getting bigger as they diet, which doesn't make any sense, right? So my hypothesis was that, we increase the protein, we try to offset this, and maybe this will be beneficial. And then I did a follow-up study, because this is one of those things where we have very little research. In fact, the only research we have, and there's about 3 or 4 studies, including the one I did, that directly answer this question, only compare very low intakes in the range of 0.8 to 1 gram per kg, or just right around, or actually as high as recently 1.2 grams per kg, which is just barely above the RDA, to high intakes in the range of, say, 1.6, which is more of a moderate intake, 1.6 grams per kg, to as high as about 2.3, 2.4 grams per kg, which is just over a gram per pound of protein. So it's not surprising that just over a gram per pound is better than 1.2 grams per kg. What I tried to study was that moderate intake of about 1.6 grams per kg, which is typically what a sports nutrition research book would tell you is appropriate for an athlete, and to something around 2.8 grams per kg, or right around 1.3 grams per pound, closer to what a bodybuilder might take in. And while I didn't find a difference in terms of strength or muscle mass in a relatively short period of 2 weeks, there was a greater sense of well-being on the surveys that I took that are typically used in studies to determine whether someone is overtraining. So the athletes on the higher protein group felt better. Maybe in a few months that would have resulted in some kind of change in strength or lean body mass or fat mass. Tough to say. But right now we know that people typically feel better while dieting on a higher protein intake, and we know that high intakes are better than low intakes. Now that said, in a dieting state, I do think you can go too high. If you're to go so high in protein intake that you're actually forcing carbohydrate and fat levels down, because remember, when you're dieting, you have a calorie budget. That can negatively affect training or physiological function, and now you've got an issue that's more important than just the protein intake you have. So, what's the maximum amount I think you should probably take in? Probably somewhere around 2.8 grams per kg of total body mass, or roughly around 1.3 grams per pound of total body mass. Any higher than that while dieting especially, and you might be forcing carbohydrate and fat too low. Whether you'll get a true benefit in terms of lean body mass retention, tough to say. It certainly won't hurt you, and it may improve your adherence by increasing satiety. And there's a decent amount of research to show that protein, up to a limit, protein does increase satiety and makes you feel better. So it could be a psychological benefit that might turn into a physiological benefit. But nonetheless, there's absolutely no harm in going up to right around that, say, 1.3 grams per pound limit. So now the question is what's the most we can benefit from while we are trying to put on muscle? Well, if you were to take a step back and look at all the studies on outcomes such as strength or muscle mass, most of the time it shows that there's not a benefit to a moderate or a high protein intake compared to one another. However, every once in a while, you will find that a higher protein intake beats out a moderate protein intake. But and in fact, I don't think ever has it been the other way around. So essentially, my tale is one of cautious skepticism, right? If we know that moderate and high protein intakes are most of the time the same, but every once in a while high seems to be better, maybe it's better to err on the high side. So typically my recommendation is to eat at least 0.8 grams per pound of protein, and you can take that a little bit higher. I would say you could actually even go higher than 1.3 grams per pound in the off season, because it certainly won't suppress your carbohydrate and fat levels. But now let's talk about why you might want to go high, or why you might want to go low within that range and kind of just skirt the lower end of what we think is optimal. Now, Jose Antonio has done a series of studies looking at very high protein intakes, right around the range of 1.5 to 2 grams per pound. Interestingly enough, even when increasing calories by adding protein, he found that people were not gaining body weight. Now, why would this be? So, let's go back to that thermic effect of food that I talked about and said we would come back to. Protein, if you add a whole bunch of protein to your diet, it's actually, almost a third of that is being burned off in terms of the thermic effect of food. Additionally, as you try to overeat, often, and most people, and there's a lot of individual variability, you'll also get an increase in energy expenditure via non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So meaning you try to eat more, your body's trying to gain weight, or you're trying to gain weight and your body's going, hold on, I don't want you to gain much weight. So between NEAT and TEF, the thermic effect of food, a lot of that calorie surplus is offset, okay? In addition, protein is very satiating, and perhaps less of the meals were totally finished, and just a few extra bites were left on the plate, or there's slight misreporting in terms of the data. It's easier to misreport when you just don't want to eat all your food and you want to remain compliant, for a study. So between satiety, increased NEAT, and increased thermic effect of food, it's actually quite hard to gain weight on a very high protein diet. So you have to ask yourself the question, are you someone who struggles not to get too fat in the off season or your bulking phase, or are you someone who struggles to put on weight in the off season? If you are a novice or intermediate and trying to gain weight and you are struggling to do so, it might be smarter to be right around that 0.8 grams per pound or 1.8 grams per kg so that it's easier to get in more food. Likewise, if you're someone who struggles not to get too fat while gaining, you might want to actually keep that protein intake even higher than the recommendations I gave at max for dieting. Nothing wrong with going as high as, say, 1.4, 1.5 grams per pound. It certainly is totally fine if you are healthy internally, you have no renal issues, 2 kidneys, everything's good to go. You could do that as a strategy to try to limit your fat gain in the off season. All right, so that about covers it. Hopefully this helps you understand the hows and whys of protein rather than just trying to memorize a number. And best of training luck to everyone, and I'll see you next time.